They say the last thing Mark Rothko painted was a door into nothingness. Not a landscape, not a figure, not even the vast luminous fields of color that made him immortal. Just two immense blocks of black and gray, swallowing each other, swallowing you, and, if you knew the man, swallowing him. A few days later, in his studio on East 69th Street in New York, Rothko was found lying on the floor, a razor blade in his hand, the smell of turpentine in the air. A final act, framed not in a museum, but on the cold concrete where he worked. But how did a boy born in a tiny Russian town, son of a poor Jewish pharmacist, survive pogroms, cross an ocean, and rise to become the painter who could make color itself feel like a holy force, only to end his life in the darkest shade of all? This is not just the story of an artist. This is a descent into obsession, into beauty, into the void. Early life, a world on fire. Marcus Yakovlevich Rothkowitz was born in 1903 in Dvinsk, a dusty provincial town in the Russian Empire. Winters there were long and merciless, and the Jewish quarters smelled of wood smoke, pickled vegetables, and fear. The Tsar's men came often, sometimes for taxes, sometimes for something far worse. Marcus's father, Jacob, was a learned man, a pharmacist who could quote Talmudic passages and prescribe a tincture for a cough in the same breath. But Jacob saw the writing on the wall. In the Russia of that time, for Jews, education was a dead end, opportunity a closed door. In whispers over weak tea the family spoke of America, the Golden Land. When Marcus was 10, the journey began. Jacob left first to Portland, Oregon, where he found work in a modest pharmacy. Months later, Marcus, his mother, and his siblings crossed the Atlantic in the foul belly of a steamship. The boy would later recall the endless gray sea, as if it had been painted already, vast, formless, without horizon. But tragedy awaited. Only a few months after they arrived, Jacob died of cancer. Marcus was left fatherless in a strange country, barely able to speak the language, surrounded by strangers who looked right through him. Poverty settled on the family like an unshakable shadow. The birth of the artist. School was both refuge and battlefield. Marcus excelled at drawing, partly because it was the only language in which he felt truly fluent. His classmates saw a quiet boy who sketched in the margins of his notebooks, faces, doorways, and strange shapes like windows into other worlds. By the time he entered Lincoln High School, Marcus had begun to master English, but he never lost the sense of being an outsider. He absorbed literature, philosophy, and, after a chance trip to a local art class, the intoxicating possibility of painting. It was at Yale, where he enrolled on scholarship, that the idea of becoming an artist took root like a dangerous weed. Rothko, as he began calling himself, hated the snobbery of the Ivy League, hated the way money dictated taste. He dropped out after 2 years, restless, already searching for something no one could quite name. New York, hunger and revelation. New York in the 1920s was a fever dream. The roar of the subway, the smell of roasting chestnuts on street corners, jazz leaking from basement clubs. Rothko wandered the city with a portfolio under his arm, knocking on doors, applying to art schools. At the Art Students League, under the guidance of Max Weber, a fellow Jewish immigrant who had studied with Matisse and Picasso, Rothko began to understand the modern revolution in art. Painting wasn't about copying reality, it was about inventing a new one. Still, the early years were brutal. He lived in cramped apartments, often skipping meals to buy paint. He took odd jobs, waiting tables, cleaning buildings, teaching art to children at the Brooklyn Jewish Center. His students adored him. One later recalled that he treated each child like a little genius in the making. And yet, Rothko felt adrift. He was painting figures then, lonely, blocky people, trapped in shallow spaces, their eyes filled with silence. It was as if, even in his earliest works, he was already trying to paint souls. The obsession begins. It was during the 1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression, that Rothko's obsession truly took hold. While other artists chased commissions or joined the WPA projects, Rothko began withdrawing, working in isolation. He read Nietzsche and Greek tragedy. He visited the Metropolitan Museum, staring for hours at Rembrandt's portraits, Turner's luminous skies. He became fascinated by myth, not as stories but as eternal emotional truths. The function of art, he once wrote, is to make the tragic present. But he wasn't there yet. His brush still clung to the human figure, to recognizable scenes. And inside, he knew he was chasing something purer, something that had no name. Mark Rothko, Part 2. The breaking point of form. By the late 1930s, Rothko's paintings were getting stranger. The figures became shadows, the rooms around them dissolved. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some dismissed him as unfinished, Others called him too abstract for realism, too realistic for abstraction. It was during these restless years that Rothko fell in with a group of like-minded painters in New York: Adolph Gottlieb, Barnett Newman, Clifford Still. They met in smoky Greenwich Village cafes, drinking bitter coffee and speaking in grand, defiant terms about what painting should be. One night, Clifford Still leaned over the table and said, almost in a whisper, "Mark, figures are a prison. Get rid of them. Paint the feeling, not the thing." That night, Rothko couldn't sleep. The words echoed in his head. He realized that every face he had painted, every hand, every eye, was just a mask hiding the real subject, the raw, wordless emotion underneath. The war years painting the unseen. The Second World War cast a black shadow over everything. Rothko, a Jewish immigrant who had fled Russian anti-Semitism, watched in horror as news of the Holocaust reached America. His art responded, not with battle scenes or propaganda, but with haunting, mythic imagery. He painted The Omen of the Eagle, 1942, where distorted, ancient-looking forms float in a blood-red space, like fragments of a ruined civilization. Critics later called this his mythological period, works that looked like the relics of a long-dead world, speaking in a language older than words. For Rothko, myth was not escape, was a mirror. If you paint the tragic, the timeless, he said, you paint now. The leap into color. And then, in the late 1940s, it happened. The change. The figures disappeared entirely. What replaced them was radical, vast, floating rectangles of color, layered in such a way that they seemed to breathe. The edges were soft, almost dissolving, so the colors didn't just sit on the canvas, they seemed to hover in front of it, pulling you in. Rothko discovered that by carefully building layer upon layer of thin paint, he could make the surface glow, like light trapped in silk. The first time he stepped back from one of these canvases, he felt something close to religious awe. It was no longer a picture of anything. It was the thing. The emotion itself. When he showed these new works to friends, reactions were extreme. Some felt uplifted as if they'd glimpsed heaven. Others said it felt like standing on the edge of an abyss. The room of silence. In 1952, Rothko began insisting on how his paintings should be displayed. No clutter. No small works mixed with large. Just a few vast canvases in a room, close together, hung low so they enveloped the viewer. He wanted you to stand close enough that your peripheral vision was swallowed by color. He wanted the outside world to disappear. And something strange happened. People cried. Not politely, not subtly, they wept openly, standing before what was essentially nothing more than 2 or 3 rectangles of color. To Rothko this was proof. "I'm not an abstractionist," he said. "I'm not interested in relationships of color or form. I'm interested in expressing basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom. And if you're moved only by color relationships, then you miss the point." Fame and its poison. By the mid-1950s, Rothko was no longer a starving artist. The Museum of Modern Art bought his work. Collectors paid thousands. His shows sold out. His name appeared alongside Pollock and de Kooning as one of the titans of the New York school. But fame didn't bring joy. If anything, it deepened his mistrust of the art world. He hated the idea of his paintings hanging in the homes of wealthy collectors, treated as expensive decor. When the Seagram Corporation commissioned him to create murals for their luxury Four Seasons restaurant in the Seagram building, he accepted, but secretly plotted to make the paintings so dark and oppressive that the diners would lose their appetite. Months later, after visiting the restaurant, he returned the money and kept the paintings. "Anybody who will eat that kind of food for those kinds of prices," he said, "will never look at a painting of mine." Those canvases, deep maroons, blacks, and reds, would later become some of his most famous works. Mark Rothko, Part 3. The colors begin to fade. By the early 1960s, Rothko's work was everywhere. Museums, prestigious galleries, the most respected critics praising him as a genius of pure emotion. But while the art world celebrated, Rothko himself was changing. The glowing oranges, yellows, and blues of the previous decade began to disappear. In their place came a heavier palette, blood reds, bruised purples, oppressive blacks. He told one friend, "I'm not painting to cheer anybody up. I'm painting the only truth I know, that beneath everything is the dark." The Houston Chapel. In 1964, Rothko received the most ambitious commission of his life, a set of paintings for a non-denominational chapel in Houston, Texas. At first he resisted. He didn't like Texas, didn't like religion, didn't like the idea of his work being tied to anything dogmatic. But the idea of creating an entire environment, a place where people could be alone with nothing but his paintings, was irresistible. He accepted. For years he worked obsessively on the Houston murals. His studio became a kind of bunker. The canvases grew darker and darker, vast fields of deep burgundy purple so dark it was almost black. The shapes were simple, looming rectangles like doors that led somewhere you couldn't see. When visitors came to the studio, they spoke in hushed voices. The paintings seemed to generate their own gravity. Rothko told them, "I hope people who look at these will feel overwhelmed, the way you feel in front of the ocean at night." The body fails. In 1968, Rothko suffered a mild aneurysm. The doctors told him to quit smoking, quit drinking, quit the late nights in the studio. They also told him to avoid the heavy lifting required for his huge canvases. But Rothko wasn't the kind of man who could slow down. Instead, the illness deepened his sense of urgency. He began painting more than ever, smaller works, yes, but with even more intensity. His marriage was collapsing. He had moved out, living alone in a grim Manhattan studio. The friends who visited said he looked pale, almost ghost-like. Darkness in the studio. The Houston Chapel paintings were finally shipped to Texas in 1971. Rothko didn't go to the installation. He was too unwell, or perhaps he couldn't face the idea of his most personal works leaving his side. Those who saw them in place said the effect was overwhelming. A silent octagonal room, lit only by a soft skylight, surrounded by 14 vast canvases in deep, mournful tones. Some visitors sat quietly for hours. Others left within minutes, unable to bear the weight of it. The final weeks. Rothko's last works in early 1970 were unlike anything he'd done before, black and gray canvases, stripped of even the suggestion of warmth. They felt like the closing of a curtain. On February 25, 1970, Rothko's assistant arrived at the East 69th Street studio and found him lying on the floor. He had taken his own life. He was 66 years old. The room smelled of turpentine. Against the wall, a final painting, 2 black rectangles, one floating above the other, separated by a thin, trembling line. The legacy. Today, Rothko's paintings are among the most expensive and sought after in the world. But to stand in front of one, especially in the Rothko Chapel in Houston, is to understand that he wasn't painting for money or fame or even beauty. He was painting to speak directly to your most private self, the part of you that doesn't have words. Rothko once said, "A painting is not a picture of an experience. It is the experience." And in that he was right. His canvases don't just show you color, they pull you into it. They make you feel both the vastness of existence and the shadow that falls over it. Epilogue, the last color. They say if you stand long enough before a Rothko, something strange happens. The colors stop being colors. The shapes stop being shapes. It's as if the painting exhales and pulls you inside. In the Rothko Chapel, the air feels heavier. The light from the skylight shifts almost imperceptibly, and the deep purples and blacks begin to move, not with your eyes but somewhere behind them. You think of the man who painted them. Alone in his studio in the winter cold. A man who chased color not for beauty but for truth, and discovered that truth was darker than anyone wanted to admit. One visitor to the chapel once whispered, "It feels like standing at the edge of the universe." And maybe that's what Rothko wanted, not for you to look at his paintings but to stand on that edge with him. To feel the pull of the void, and the terrifying peace that comes with it. Outside the sun still shines. Inside the paintings watch you go, their silence following you like a shadow. And somewhere in the black between those rectangles, Mark Rothko still waits. For someone brave enough to step through.